The International Monetary Fund says the global economy will face a significant slowdown this year, in part because of Donald Trump's tariffs. Hello there, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. It is certainly not the news the International Monetary Fund expected to deliver this week, as it acknowledged the global tariffs announced by U.S. President Donald Trump earlier this month changed everything. The IMF downgrading the global growth outlook to 2.8% this year, and says the United States has put itself at a much higher risk of a recession. IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gorenchas discussed the report at the IMF World Bank spring meetings in Washington, D.C. CGTN Su Tao had the chance to speak with him about the IMF's projections for China's economy.
So in the case of China, so this is the flip side. The U.S. supply shock increases inflation, lowers activity. In the case of China and other countries, it's a negative demand shock. So the demand for Chinese goods is going to be reduced because of the tariffs that are imposed by the U.S. And again, the uncertainty also is a factor that reduces demand for goods and economic activity more generally. So we're seeing a downgrade in Chinese growth for 2025 to 4%. We were projecting 4.6%. Now we're projecting 4%.
For more on the U.S. tariffs and the impact on the global economy, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Rio de Janeiro is Vitelio Brustolin. He is a professor of international relations at Fluminense Federal University and a researcher with Harvard University. Also with us, Klisman Murati. He's the founder and CEO of Pareto Economics and creator of the Global Power Index. From Hong Kong, Denis Simon is a non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Qiang is an assistant director of the International Monetary Institute in Beijing. And that's where we'll begin. Let me start with you with this question. It seems like it's all doom and gloom from the IMF as far as these U.S. tariffs, the trade war. But China's growth downgraded, and yet the IMF chief economist talked about the efforts that China is taking to actually soften this blow. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
The impact of the tariffs on the Chinese economy, in our assessment, is quite large. The tariffs by themselves would reduce growth in China by 1.3 percentage point. But there are other things that the Chinese economy and the Chinese authorities are doing that are helping to offset some of this. So there have been a number of measures in terms of fiscal support that have been announced since the beginning of the year, and this is providing some support to the Chinese economy, and that's why we land with only a 0.6 percentage point downgrade.
So, Qiang, in a sense, the Chinese government trying to inoculate itself from the damage of these tariffs. Give us a sense of where they're at in this effort.
Well, I think IMF does have a reason for downgrading Chinese economic growth perspective, but I think China still have a very resilient economy on Chinese side. For example, if you take a look at the current government statement, actually China has been making a lot of effort. For example, prioritize the domestic consumption, and also we're trying to put more of the investment on the domestic infrastructure building. And meanwhile, the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as for the RCEP agreement, are actually been helping China to bond with more of the overseas partners in the regard of the trade and also in the regard of the international investment. So I think this is very different from what's happening 60 years ago, like you only have to choose between the two sides of the world. Right now, is still a multilateral, trading systems and investment systems. So you don't actually need to be bonded with just one side. There are many things to do with the whole world, and also domestically. Besides the domestic, demand, as well as for the international cooperation, I think China is trying to, solve the problem from the root, which is climbing up the value chain to upgrade its whole economic structures by investing more on the tech-savvy industries, to invest on the top-notch, technology. So all these will actually helping China to transform itself from a middle-income country to a higher-income country. As for the United States, we've been talking to the DC experts. They've been providing us with a very interesting perspective. They're saying that during this conflict of the tariffs, actually American has been, we hurt even more. It's because right now between the two sides trade. Actually, America's products actually can be replaceable in China, but Chinese products is very replaced in America. For example, if you want to buy something, groceries, daily supplies, house appliances, it looks like you can buy things from a lot of country suppliers from all over the world. But talking about the performance versus price ratio, actually China can provide the best ratio above all the competitors, and many of the products actually. 80% of the market share of the whole world has been in China's hand, or 80% of the IP supporting those products has been in China's hands. But on the contrary, American products that have been sold in China, for example, like the semiconductors, like the jet planes, actually can be replaced, in China. China right now can build its own jet plane. And talking about the high-end, weapons or semiconductors, they've been banned China for getting access to it a very long time ago. So China has already been finding its own alternative suppliers, a very long time ago. So actually, we don't think that kind of a black belt can actually hurt Chinese economy. But for America, the lingering inflation, rising prices, and also the shortage in the supply can actually be a huge problem.
And Denis, to that point, it seems as though China is prepared to absorb some of the shocks from this, and it seems like some of this is sinking in the administration, with the Treasury Secretary saying today in a private investor summit hosted by J.P. Morgan Chase that de-escalation in the trade war with China is expected in the very near future. I mean, he says this isn't sustainable. What did you make of these comments?
Well, I think he's basically understanding that the reality is that the United States needs China and China needs the United States, that we have a very interdependent economy, set of economies. And even though both leaders say they want to make their economies more resilient and, in fact, even to de-link to some extent, I think that the reality of the Secretary in his comments are just suggesting that it is much better on both sides if we build bridges rather than to continue to tear them asunder. And I think that hopefully better minds will prevail and that they will come to some terms. Let's also not forget that China has been making a transition away from its role as factory to the world to becoming much more an innovation-driven economy. And in February of this year, Xi Jinping met with the small and medium technological entrepreneurs, some of whom have now grown into big giants like Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. And he mended fences with these gentlemen. And he has now recognized the importance of having a two-edged economy, one that has a number of state-directed enterprises, but also a very vibrant tech private sector that is really the vanguard, the technological cutting edge of the Chinese economy, and he's giving more support to those entities so that they can hopefully help with the recovery of the economy.
And Denis, one of the other things you can say about China is, this opening up and reforms. We've been hearing that for a long, long time, and they continue to make these efforts to entice more business from out of the country into China. While the Trump leadership seems to be closing things down, as you said, they should be building bridges. That doesn't appear to be on the slate of late. More unilateralism, protectionism. What are your thoughts on these dual approaches?
Well, my sense is that it's always good to walk on two legs. The idea of bringing back or having in place some strategically important manufacturing, especially to reduce supply chain vulnerabilities, that's a great idea. But we're not going to bring back 20th century style factories, many of which had been sent overseas as part of globalization and the restructuring of our respective economies. And so I think that we've got to wake up to the reality that China is going to continue to be a very important element. In other words, the rise of China is not something that's just a short-term blip on the screen that we make a modest adjustment. This is a long-term phenomena that we're going to have to understand how to deal with. And I think that is very critical that we get away from the rhetoric that's been too dominant in this discussion, and begin to recognize that the more we work with China, the more that not only will our two countries benefit, but also the rest of the world. And I don't think there's any country that wants to simply take sides in this conflict. They want to basically have both countries play nice so they can play nice with both of these countries at the same time. So the global ramifications of this are significant. And if we could find some kind of common ground, I think this is a win-win for the globe. That's why, when the IMF says the global economy is going to slow down, what it also sort of suggested is, however, if we could improve this relationship, actually everyone could benefit. So a rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that's the way we ought to be thinking about this.
And Klisman, the IMF making it very clear, a 10% tax on nearly everything the United States imports is ultimately going to hurt the U.S., but it's also going to have a tough time for the trading partners as well. There is this 90-day pause to allow countries to negotiate. We did see the Italian Prime Minister come to Washington last week, meet at the White House. Is that going to make much of a difference with the European Union and the 27-nation bloc, do you think?
I suppose the Italian charm will be tested in these political testing times. What's really important to realize is that Europe really is not unified as to how they will respond and what scenario planning strategies they're putting forward. The reason is because you have 27 different countries with 27 different bilateral relationships with the United States, 27 sets of rankings of the US being either a major or a minor or a mezzanine export partner. So with all of these different configurations, what the EU really has to do is to figure out what can they all unify on and how they can bring this argument to the United States, and also what levers can they pull, what do they have to their advantage that they can showcase to the United States as to why that 10% shouldn't be 10%, but should be lower or shouldn't be existing at all. Now, the one thing they can unify towards is energy security. With the US being potentially a major source of LNG into Europe, that could be something that could bring them together, especially the bigger economies who relied historically on Russian natural gas. And something they can bring to the table is the fact that their active consumer markets, which is one of the tenets of our global power index, is major, right? And they're a big buyer of American software and a big buyer of other products and services. Some contention points, or one major contention point that I think they will have is, for example, food standards, because the agricultural standards and rules and regulations in the EU are much, much tougher than the ones in America. So if Trump wants to make farming great again, or whatever the catchphrase is, he is going to need to make sure that the EU accepts these standards so that more trade can happen with the EU, at least on that form of business. Many things to consider, but it's definitely the most important 90 days, I think, for Europe over the next 4 years.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, we've seen an Italian leader come into the White House, but we're not seeing a lot of perhaps Italian tourists. I mean, tourism is going to take a hit here in the United States. There's a report out that it's likely the United States is likely to lose about $90 billion in lost revenues. Places like tourists from the United Kingdom and Germany have chosen not to visit the United States. I mean, what's going to be the impact there, do you think?
I mean, unlike Italy, which has the Amalfi Coast, and they rely quite heavily on tourism, at least in some parts of Italy and in the Mediterranean parts of Europe, America doesn't need to rely on tourism to boost its GDP as much as parts of Europe does. I think business is still going strong in the United States, especially with Trump's vision as to what he wants to create with the United States. I think people not coming to the United States could be almost a protest vote, but we'll see how long that could last for, especially if the tune changes around Trump and if his policies change, or if they can reach some sort of agreements, then maybe that will change. But what Trump really cares about isn't tourism. It's about how can he build the middle classes in America? How can these rust belts be de-rustified and be made new again? And how can he inspire this with the new technological era of domination, which we're going to see and we are seeing currently in the world, and how can the US still be a leader in this? Tourism comes very low down in his list because the people that he wants to inspire to come to the United States are businesses, and tourism will change as the political winds also hopefully change also.
Vitelio, the IMF chief economist, saying the uncertainty about the U.S. tariffs harming the global economy. What do you think is going to be the impact?
I believe that some countries like Brazil and countries in South America will try to create new bridges with Europe. For example, there is an agreement between Mercosur, that is an organization inside South America, with the European Union. Also, some countries in South America would like to have deals with the United States, for example, Argentina. President Milei is a big friend of President Trump, and President Milei is proposing a deal between the Mercosur and US. On the other hand, some countries like Uruguay would like to have deals with China, for example. So also South America is divided by now, and there is no easy choice here. China is the main partner for most of countries in South America, but the US is still the second main partner. So most of the countries in this part of the world have 10% of tariffs, but they would prefer, of course, have 0% back.
What do you think the outlook is for Brazil?
Brazil is divided. We have a good relationship with China. Brazil is part of BRICS. But also the president of Brazil, Lula, has no good relationship with Trump. So they don't have any diplomatic relationship so far. It's weird because Brazil is half of South America in terms of GDP, also in terms of population. I think Brazil will try to negotiate with the US. I think this will be the main strategy of the countries of this part of the world, but also from countries of European Union, try to negotiate, try to be rational, because no one believes that tariffs of Trump is imposing have some economic theory behind them. Everybody believes that it to be harmful for everybody.
And Qiang, when you talk about harm, you look at Chinese products being now seeing tariffs 144-45%, and China, of course, slapping 112% tariffs on U.S. goods. Wall Street Journal says you add all this together, it's going to be about $582 billion of trade now threatened by the world's two largest economies. And as we mentioned earlier, the Treasury Secretary saying that basically this is not sustainable. Afterwards, the press secretary said that that Trump is setting the stage for a deal with China. The ball's moving in the right direction, but they also are not indicating that there's any potential for a real trade deal, even talks. What are you hearing there?
Well, my source tells me that the technocrats from both sides are trying to, reach each other because they understand the gravity of the whole incident, how it's going to hurt both sides, the economy and the whole world. And I think the whole world understands this, but the Trump administration. So I think in D.C. they're telling me that the technocrat is going to try to, use the internal channels to talk to the Trump administration to, endorse this kind of the first contact with China. And China, according to my sources, is fully prepared to, talk to American counterparts on the technological, sides to, mitigate the whole impact. But this is just one thing. And I think, in America, probably the whole, situation and the whole impact is going to span out in probably 3 to 6 months. And after realizing the gravity, American probably will, agree to, talk to its, competitors in the regard of the tariffs. And also, I think I would like to point out, according to our modeling, the whole situation probably was going to encounter is the first turning point at the end of the June or the early of the July, and also the second turning point probably is going to happen at the end of the September or early October. And I would like to say that according to our history and the whole, according to our experience in the whole history, the world economy is more resilient and more complicated than we can expect. Well, we have two examples. One, very extreme examples. One is in the probation period of time. The second time is in the anti-drug war, between America and Mexico or Latin America. Even though America has been posted very, very strong, prohibitions on all kinds of these, economic activities. Well, if we do not talk about its nature, but still, this kind of the, trade cannot be fully, tamed or just, vanished. So I think at that time it becomes an even larger network to allow this kind of the product to flow all over the borders. So I think this is even when we're talking about illegal product, and when we're talking about the really legal trade, for example, the groceries, house appliances, and things like that. And I think the whole world probably is going to join in this network and maybe to bypass all kinds of the restrictions or take some detour, but still allow this product to reach on the shores they are meant to reach. So I think we don't really need to worry about this impact, even though this year the whole world probably will face the extreme impact of about 1% of the GDP all over the globe, a GDP drop all over the globe. But maybe in 1 or 2 years to come, we're going to see this impact will be very largely mitigated, no matter Trump administration will change its mind or not.
Well, let me ask you about the Chinese Foreign Ministry, because they came out on Monday with a warning saying that they were firmly opposed to any deal between the United States and its trading partners that comes at the expense of Chinese interests. Is the U.S. trying to pressure some of its allies to pick sides?
Yes, we've been hearing that there is a message been sent under the table that a lot of alliances need to choose side, but the situation is very different, actually different from the Iron Curtain period of time, because this time American opposing these kind of the tariff to everybody on Canada, on Mexico, even though suspended right now, but they didn't say they're going to be revoked. And also European Union, the largest trading partner / political alliances are also on the pressure. So I think this time it's very, very difficult for these alliances to choose side. Right now from the Australia side, that their government is talking, a very, very harsh argument going on in the cabinet, because they're saying Australia has also been bleeding out, and no matter they're going to choose side or not. So this is going to be a very devastating situation for Australia, especially for the raw material exporters. So I think even the ironclad alliances like Australia or New Zealand or England is going to say no, or they're going to say don't vote for this. I don't think the other alliances is going to very clearly to choose side. They're probably going to just stand aside and just watch to see how it's going to span out, and probably they're going to profit mostly for their own sake.
And Denis, the U.S. president says he wants to revive American manufacturing like what we saw in the 1940s and 50s, make America wealthy again, as Klisman was saying, basically de-rust the Rust Belt. But I was in China last year, and you go to these manufacturing sites, and there's robots everywhere. There aren't a lot of workers. So the world he's talking about is the world of the past, where it seems like China is jetting into the future. Can you talk a little bit about this clash? I mean, this kind of manufacturing he's describing doesn't seem to exist anymore.
Well, it doesn't exist in the United States, and it probably is not going to exist. I remember I was a young assistant professor at MIT, and in 1983, manufacturing was a main focal point of many of the MBA students who were attending the school and looking for careers. But 20 years later, manufacturing was no longer even one of the high priority curricular areas. So that means that we haven't been training manufacturing managers for a long, long time in the United States. And it would be very difficult to see if we could even find a talent pool that can operate the kind of factories that you have referred to. I was in the city of Quincy for a number of years. This is where Foxconn, the Taiwan company that does a lot of work for Apple, when I got there, there were like 250,000 workers in their facilities. 5 years later, when I left, if you walked in, it was primarily robotic arms, high-level automation, and this was the factory of the future. So when China talks about MIC 2025 or other kind of programs on emerging technologies, it's all talking about advanced manufacturing at a level that the United States even has not seen in many, many years. So I think Trump is barking up the wrong tree. Again, it's not a bad idea to reduce some degree of supply chain vulnerability, but that just means a reconfiguration of supply chain. It doesn't mean everything made in the United States. We live in a globally interdependent world. And while globalization of the 80s and 90s may not be the case any longer, and we live in a world of much more fragmented globalization, the reality is that we're going to end up with a beggar thy neighbor world in which everyone is on the lose-lose trail. And I think that's just not going to be good for anyone. So hopefully there are some people, maybe it's even Elon Musk, who's going to raise those issues, because he understands clearly from his experience with Tesla that he needs a global manufacturing platform and not just country by country by country.
Klisman, lose-lose trail. I mean, when you talk about losing, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is on track for its worst performance in April since 1932. We've seen, the tariffs basically wipe out trillions of dollars in stock market value. The dollar's lost nearly 10% of its value. Are investors simply pulling out of the United States? What do you make of what's happening on Wall Street?
Look, investors want predictability. Now, predictability in the world of politics doesn't always mean visionary. Now, what I'm not saying is Trump has a vision that he wants to bring forth that the investing community doesn't understand. But a lot of the time, what the long-term aim for a country is, which is the responsibility of a politician and politics, isn't the same. They don't have the same incentives as a investor who's looking for predictability in where a specific company is going to go towards. Now, the direction of that company may sometimes come into a clash with the vision of what the politicians say we want to do for the country. So Trump wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. That means companies that manufacture, US companies that manufacture abroad, they don't have the same incentives aligned with Trump. So the only way to really reconcile this is through communication, is through Trump and his team who are very much experienced in markets, Besson, for example, and others who have a lot of experience in the business world, to really communicate the strategy and the long-term vision of what a Trump administration wants to do for the United States consistently to different investing demographics. So at least that way they can buy into this vision and in some way, shape, or form, perhaps even support this vision if they see it beneficial to them. But what we really have is an approach by Trump, which is blanket, right, which doesn't really go into depth as to what the logic is. We hear the same rhetoric coming out of his team and himself, nothing new really, which is really making investors feel what is next, what will come next, and how will the world respond to this. Now, this uncertainty breeds a mentality which is scared, which doesn't want to invest in the long term, which means businesses don't put front the money for hiring, for R&D, because they don't know what position the country will be in the next 3 to 4 months, let alone 3 to 4 years, given the fact that China is also a major player in the world and the reliance that companies now have to China. If they see the two biggest kids on the field fighting, no one wants to be involved to bet which one will win, because it's lose-lose either way. So there are definitely hang-ups that Trump has towards China that he's trying to resolve, and he's placing big bets on this. And markets really need to understand what is the vision of Trump, and the best way he should communicate that is through constant communication, publicly and privately, with them.
Well, it's certainly something we'll all be keeping our eye on. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. A great discussion. That's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.